maybe let's get started. And if people fill in during the introductory comments, I'm sure they can catch up with it. So welcome everyone to the Anthropocene Histories seminar today. My name is Andrew Seaton. I'm a historian based in the Department of History at UCL. For those who haven't attended before, the Anthropocene Histories seminar has been running for a number of years as a collaboration between scholars at UCL, Oxford, and Cambridge. And the purpose of the seminar is to invite speakers to come and talk about really the relationship of history to the concept of the Anthropocene. And we've had many fantastic talks over the last couple of years, which if you want to, you can see recordings of on our website. And this academic year, we've had two sessions so far, one on experimental writing in the Anthropocene, and another on learning from past sustainability, where we had two medieval scholars speaking to us on that topic. This session will also be recorded, so if you have to drop out early or anything, don't worry about it. You can watch the rest of it on the website, but we will not be recording the Q&A section at the end, just to promote freedom of discussion. So our theme today is images of extraction. The extraction of natural resources from the earth is, of course, a key element of the modern world of industrial capitalism, and to many scholars, the leading human-made process that has led to the Anthropocene. So we think about the extraction of resources like coal, oil, lithium in our own moment, whatever it might be. This is a world-changing process. Now, processes of extraction are, of course, advanced and experienced in many different ways, but they're also frequently mediated through images. If we think about extraction in our own minds, our thoughts might turn to woodcuts of mining in the early modern period. We might think about paintings of the industrial city in the 19th century, or we might think about photographs of from our own moment of scarred landscapes from mining. Images are then key mediums for shaping our understanding of extraction and are in themselves products of materials produced by extractive processes themselves. And to discuss these themes, we have two fantastic speakers working very much at the edge of research on imagery of extraction, and I'm going to introduce both of them now. So our first speaker is Jarrod Hore. Jarrod is an environmental historian of settler colonial landscapes, nature writing, and geology. He's currently a co-director of the New Earth Histories research program at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and he's also recently been made a lecturer there, so congratulations to him for that. And I'd really recommend reading Jarrod's first book, Visions of Nature: How Landscape Photography Shaped Settler Colonialism, published with UNC Press in 2022. I used it last term in teaching. Students really liked it. And the book very powerfully shows shows the complicity of early photography in settler colonialism in 19th century Australia, New Zealand, and also in California. And it shows the ways how supposedly open space was reconfigured into a site of settler belonging, and as well as the ambivalences and contradictions within that process. And we also should be very grateful to Jarrod because he is speaking to us live from Australia, and obviously dealing with a very significant time difference in doing that. So we're very grateful for him being willing to stay up and speak to us on more forgiving timeframes. Our second speaker is Siobhan Angus. Siobhan works at the intersections of art history, media studies, and the environmental humanities. She's an assistant professor of media studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And I can also heartily recommend Siobhan's first book, Camera Geologica, An Elemental History of Photography, which was published with Duke University Press in 2024. And this book artfully provides a history of photography from the perspective of the mine, showing the materials that made photography possible, like bitumen or silver, and how photography itself represents the extractions of those same materials in aesthetic terms. So again, two fantastic speakers really to walk us through this theme today. Both are going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from there. So we're going to start with Siobhan and then move on to Jarrod. So Siobhan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction, and to Andrew, Emma, and John for organizing today's event. It's such a vital lecture series, and it's great to see so many people here. Today, I'm speaking from Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And the material from my talk today is drawn from my recent book, Camera Geologica, which thinks about a mineral history of the medium. All right, everyone can see my slides? Great. In 1871, the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company hired Carleton Watkins to document a hydraulic mining operation at Malakoff Diggins in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. A photograph of the scene holds industry and nature in a delicate balance. The arc of water from the hydraulic hoses resembles a set of rainbows, gently cascading in front of the rock cliffs. The curvilinear ridge frames the scene, while hazy vapor softens the hardness of the exposed rock. In the foreground, smooth water streams through rugged stone. A bridge intrudes into the landscape, while the rock face dwarfs 5 men who pose casually, looking towards the camera as pressurized water reshapes the ecosystem. The miners are diminutive compared to the water and the rock, but by harnessing water as a productive force, they dominate the landscape. And the strength was remarkable. The water cannons blasted 16,000 gallons of water per minute, removing 4,000 cubic yards of earth every day. The dramatic, large format mammoth print has a remarkable precision that brings the scene into sharp focus and creates a sense of tactility, emphasizing the spray of the water and the striation in the rock cliff. The detail enhances the tenuous equilibrium of the photograph, but a closer look reveals a set of forces in conflict within the image. The striking formal beauty of the scene stands in contrast to contemporary descriptions of Malakoff Diggins, which was described as desolate and forbidding. But the image sustains a fantasy of nature and industry held in balance because the more damaging aspects of blasting are illegible within the photographic frame. Hydraulicking was pioneered in the 1850s during the California gold rush to facilitate the search for new ore bodies by blasting overburden, this is everything above the silver or gold, with pressurized water. As a concept, overburden reveals a particular way of seeing nature that prioritizes extraction. The demands of capitalist extraction recast trees, rocks, flowers, plants, insects, and animals as obstacles, burdens to be blasted away to facilitate the removal and processing of an ecosystem for profit. Appropriately, there are no visible traces of animal, insect, or plant life in the frame. It's estimated that 12 billion tons of debris was washed downstream, damaging 40,000 acres of land in the vicinity of the mining operation. But the image renders this violence quietly aesthetic. Indeed, the mining company commissioned Watkins to document the site in order to raise capital investment for the company. Encouraging further extraction is the intended function of the image. And within the scene, the non-mining histories of this landscape are unevenly represented, if at all. The foundational act of violence that made hydraulic blasting possible was the expropriation of indigenous land. The Sierra Nevadas are the traditional territory of the Nisenan people. The gold rush brought a flood of migration and changes in land use that resulted in dispossession. This history of expropriation of indigenous land is not visible, though the fruits of the labor of Chinese migrant workers is. Malakoff Diggins' infrastructure was mostly built by Chinese laborers who dug reservoirs out of the mountains to provide water for blasting, building over 5,000 miles of flumes, canals, and ditches, which supplied water to the mines. This infrastructure then harnessed water as a productive force, in a sense, putting it to work. The spectacular, immediate destructiveness of the hydraulic blast killed plants, insects, animals, and people. It also led to flooding and mercury contamination as mud, gravel, and debris clogged waterways. But the photograph also can't show us what was to come, a landscape shattered by the pressure of blasting. The effects of hydraulic mining still mark the eroded landscape of Malakoff Diggins, an industrial Grand Canyon. However, the decimated landscape did lead to the first environmental legal decision issued in the United States, as California banned hydraulic blasting in 1884. And today I want to propose that Watkins' photograph stages a confrontation between deep time and industry that makes visible what, following Marx, we might call metabolic rift, a fracture between the natural world and the human society that grew out of it, an internal rift driven by the perpetually accelerating growth imperatives of capitalism. For Marx, humans were part of nature, but the extraction of more and more energy, both in the form of natural resources and labor, to create endless accumulations of capital, disrupts, for Marx, the temporal complementarity, or metabolism, of human activities in its relation to other ecological processes making up life on Earth. So Marx links ecological thought with economic theory, highlighting the incompatibility of capitalism's imperatives for growth and speed with natural processes which require limits to use and periods of recovery in order to successfully renew. The rapid speed of industrial growth jolted human society out of sync, out of time. So at least three temporalities coexist within Watkins' image: the gradual layering of geological time visible in the stratified rock, the hyperacceleration of industrial mining, and the flash of light that set the photograph in silver. I begin here because Watkins' visually striking photograph also gestures to the materiality of the print itself. Metals used in photography, silver, gold, and mercury, were mined in Malakoff Diggins. Silver forms light-sensitive silver halides, gold is the toner, and mercury is a development agent. So ecosystems like Malakoff Diggins provided the raw materials for photography, establishing an essential link between the arts of photography and the multi-sided work of mining. And it's this material and social connection between mining and photography that lies at the heart of my research. I analyze the extraction of materials by focusing on images whose subject matter and materiality tell us something about these processes and their extension into the social and ecological worlds of work and despoilation that make them possible. Different materials have been extracted from the earth at various points in photography's history to facilitate image making. Over the course of the book, I focus on 6: bitumen, silver, platinum, iron, uranium, and rare earth elements. In the present, of course, we can think about the many, many elements that go into making digital cameras or smartphones, as well as the infrastructure that sustains photo storage, usually in the cloud. And exploring the role played by materials in photographic processes allows us, in turn, to consider how these images help us make sense of the social relations that sustain our world as it is. So I'm not suggesting that the history of photography can be reduced to a history of the mind, but new histories surface when we reorient our vantage point. So today I want to ask, how does photography look from the perspective of the mine. A focus on mining enacts a reorientation of vision that directs our attention underground. Light is often emphasized in photographic discourse, reflected in its name, which means written with light. But light is only part of the story. It's the interaction of light with metals that makes photography possible. So accordingly, I'm interested in what happens when we shift the focus from light to metals or minerals to consider the histories of labor and environment that underpin the photographic object. An emphasis on mined materials draws into view the connective tissue between geology, raw materials, labor, empire, colonization, and art. So thinking materially alongside representation, considering photographs as both objects and images, yields new insights into the role photography plays in environmental change and how it might be used to help us make sense of processes like extraction. So at the root of my talk today is a simple premise. Photography begins underground, and in images of mines and mining frequently returns there. Because since its inception, both analog and digital photographs have relied on both small and large-scale extraction. In 1863, Oliver Wendell Holmes vividly described a visit to a photographic supply factory. He summarized that annually, photographic industries in the United States use 10 tons of silver and half a ton of gold. Silver is the most important mineral used in photography. Silver bullion is chemically reduced to silver halides, which produces light-sensitive salts. Once exposed to light, the halides darken, fixing the image. Other metals and minerals are used in photography, but silver halides are by far the most common in film photography. Holmes also noted photography's industrial nature. The factory was powered by steam and labor was subdivided. So there's a sort of proto-assembly line division of labor shown in these illustrations of the factory. But this demand for materials, the industrial nature of the medium, continued to escalate as photography became a mass amateur medium by the end of the 19th century. By the 20th century, photographic industries consumed over 20% of silver produced worldwide. By the 1950s, Kodak alone was using 2 tons of silver per day. That's about 4,000 pounds, a number that would increase until 1999 when the demand for silver in photography peaked. The silver stock was dramatized in this Life ad, which shows their famous silver vault. Here, Kodak reminds us that silver bullion and the film negative are the same substance, silver, pure metallic silver. So Kodak draws a direct line between silver and photography, wrapping photography in the glamour of the precious metal. Superimposed over the photograph is a magnified insert, revealing the filamentary threads of metallic silver entangled on the paper. Here, the treasure behind the snapshot is directly depicted. We see the photograph and the silver that forms the print, the image and its material basis. Elsewhere, Kodak reflected, to dig metal out of the dark earth, flash light on it for a tiny fraction of a second, and obtain a picture marvelously rich in detail and texture, there's a touch of the miraculous in it, isn't there? So this emphasis on the miraculous nature of photography directs attention to photography's alchemical transformations, which transform pure silver bullion into the silver halides that form the blackened traces of silver in the photograph. So, as they articulate, the history of photography is, in one important, very material sense, connected to the history of the mine. Silver has to be dug out of the dark earth before it can be used in photography. In the ad, however, we see the raw material, not the labor that extracts or transforms it. While the quote names a chain of photographic production, the mine, the darkroom, the print, the focus is on the magic metal rather than the labor required to process and transform the raw material. Indeed, Kodak required an incredible amount of both materials and labor to meet the burgeoning demand for home photography. But the massive chains of work making photography possible were rarely made visible, subsumed under the heading of the rest in Kodak's famous slogan, "You push the button, we do the rest." To scale up the production of photography, Kodak swept all the work that made it possible out of the viewfinder. Metals and minerals were not the only materials used. As Kodak summarized, film is animal, vegetable, and mineral, borrowing the slogan of The Alchemist. On the slide, we see cotton, gelatin, and silver bullion as primary ingredients. To explain, plant fibers like cotton and linen became photographic paper. By 1929, Kodak used more than 5 million pounds of cotton annually. The gelatin in film stock came from the skin, bones, and connective tissue of cattle, sheep, and pigs. Eventually, the demand was so high that slaughterhouses became integrated into the photographic production chain. Indeed, controlling the supply chain of materials was key to Kodak's success. In 1882, just as Kodak was beginning to grow as a company, widespread complaints of fogged and darkened plates stopped production. The issue was in the gelatin, but they struggled to locate the root cause. The crisis almost ruined Kodak financially and resulted in the company tightly monitoring supply chains. Decades later, a Kodak emulsion scientist discovered that cattle who consumed mustard seed metabolized a sulfuric substance which enhanced the light sensitivity of silver halides, enabling better film speeds. It turned out that the poor quality gelatin in 1882 was due to a lack of mustard seed in the cow's diet. The head of research at Kodak concluded, if cows didn't like mustard, there wouldn't be any movies at all. So by controlling the diet of cows used to make gelatin, Kodak ensured the quality of its film stock. The image comes alive through animal death, carried along by the work of ranchers, meat packers, and Kodak production workers. In addition to the extensive use of organic materials, photography is also synthetic, tracking the rise of the chemicals industry in the late 19th century. By the mid-20th century, the Kodak Park plant produced hundreds of different chemicals for use in photography and thousands of research chemicals, which found myriad applications across industries. Perhaps most significantly, photographic film was one of the earliest applications of plastic. Cellulose nitrate, the first semi-synthetic polymer, coated glass plates, and transparent roll film. Cellulose nitrate is perhaps best known as gun cotton, a mild explosive that was also quickly applied in mining. So these material realities of production undermine many of the stories photography likes to tell about itself, whether its ease, its lack of mediation, or its non-organic technological sophistication. Photography has long been invested in appearing immaterial, a lightness, pure vision, unchained from the earthly work of production and reproduction. Photography isn't alone in this desire to transcend a banal materiality. Artists often try and overcome paint and canvas to produce something more meaningful, creating a rift between the object and the masterpiece, which is often located in the immaterial idea. But photography promises the possibility of an unmediated lens onto the world. Of all mediums, it is the most effective at concealing its materiality. Yet vast amounts of earthly materials have to be dredged up to make photography seem weightless. So Camera Geologica turns to these questions of expropriation that lie at the heart of photography. And extraction is both a material process and also a worldview. Materially, extraction provides the raw materials that give our world form. Fundamentally, mining is a problem of material production. The raw materials, machinery, facilities, and labor used to produce goods. Extraction describes the physical processes of taking raw natural materials from the earth, which, under extractive capitalism, results in so many places in the violent dispossession of indigenous peoples and the destruction of lands, waters, and non-human species. Extraction is the first step in an accumulative process through which materials are transformed into wealth. And some of these materials become the foundations for art making. This link is made explicit in the Prussian metallurgist Georgius Agricola's groundbreaking 16th century pedagogical guide to mining and metallurgy, De Re Metallica, or On the Nature of Metals, which argues that the mine is a precondition for art. Agricola observed mining techniques during the Central European mining boom in the 15th and 16th century, and his text marks a transition within mining from artisanal practice to codified engineering knowledge. Importantly, De Re Metallica was lavishly illustrated with woodcuts and created deliberate visual motifs intended to shape ways of relating to land and labor under industrial mining. The photo theorist Alan Zakula observes that mining was one of the first industries to be pictured visually, while the geologist Martin Rudwick argues that developing a visual language was central to producing geological knowledge. So specific modes of visual representation perform crucial work in the context of developing both the means and social relations required to enable mining on an expanded scale. Agricola's treatise also responds to criticisms of mining that decried it as causing conflict, environmental damage, and greed. Agricola contested imaginaries of nature as a nurturing mother to present a more instrumental conception of nature. And one of the ways he defends mining is by pointing to art. Agricola reminds us that metals were used in pigments, tools, and as decoration. He summarizes with the reflection: how few artists could make anything that is beautiful and perfect without using metals. And this is what I want to highlight: the deployment of art to justify mining. Here we see a very early example of art washing, using art to make climate damaging practices seem more green, more culturally acceptable. But importantly, Agricola also links extraction to culture, which highlights that extraction is not simply a material reality, but is a cultural problem as well. It's a way of seeing and understanding the world. As a worldview, extraction views nature, and often the people understood as being part of nature, as a resource to be expropriated. This way of seeing promotes economic growth as an all-consuming priority. Nature becomes a backdrop to human activity and a storehouse of resources. Agricola's text responds to shifting cultural values around mining and nature, highlighting how materials are enmeshed within cultural and economic systems that change over time. Nature is not a static condition that lies outside of culture. The imaginaries of materials take on different cultural valences in different contexts and historical moments. So the mine as an imaginary emerges from the material realities of labor and environment. As such, I do not want to posit one singular relationship to extraction. The forms of labor and technology required to extract, process, and transform these materials are different, resulting in disparate cultural imaginaries and political possibilities. This is one of the reasons that the structure of the book turns to different materials to denaturalize a singular explanation of extraction. So Agricola's text predates photography by a few centuries, but we can imagine photography's reliance on metals would provide another defense of mining for Agricola. What are the visual imperatives of extraction, and how do these imperatives shape how we see and know? Nicholas Mirzoff describes this way of seeing as Anthropocene visuality, a way of seeing that obscures rather than reveals environmental and social injustices, rooted in an understanding of the human relationship with nature as conquest. Mirzoff suggests Anthropocene visuality allows us to move on, to see nothing and keep circulating commodities, despite the destruction of the biosphere. One example of Anthropocene visuality, or what we might call the extractive gaze, is a 1918 ad for a mining explosives company, the Hercules Powder Co., which ran in a Saturday Evening Post. Coal is emblazoned over a cartoonish drawing of a stegosaurus in front of rock cliffs. The ad exalts: millions of years before the advent of man, nature was preparing for his comfort. In the gray dawn of the world, when gigantic saurians dragged their ungainly bodies through thickets of giant ferns, when mighty tempests beat to earth trees as tall as cathedral spires, when flying reptiles bigger than aeroplanes rushed screaming through the air, she was laying the foundations for our coal beds. The ad goes on to describe the importance of dynamite to coal miners, who are in turn central to the US war effort in World War I. So the anthropocentrism of the ad is hyperbolic. It looks back hundreds of millions of years and concludes that the sole destiny of the dinosaur was to transform itself into a fossil fuel for the future comfort of human beings. The metaphors deployed reframe natural phenomena in human terms. Trees become cathedral spires, animals become airplanes. And the ad narrates a guiding hand prefiguring the eventual dominion of humans over nature. In this framework, coal mining is not just necessary, or even a necessary evil, but it is right, it is preordained. And although the cartoonish Stegosaurus is charming, most fossil fuels are formed by plants, trees, and tiny marine organisms, despite the popular association of fossils with dinosaurs. And the ad taps into dino fascination by dressing coal in the charisma and grandeur of the prehistoric great beasts. In the process, the ads divert attention away from the messier realities of coal mining to frame the use of fossil fuels as benign. This way of seeing the world recasts environmental degradation as progress under the guise of technological innovation, economic development, and an increasing quality of life. At the same time, it appeals to ideas of nature and the natural to legitimize the exploitation of both humans and the natural world. As the ad shows us, extractive capitalism did not just change materials into commodities, but it also assembled a constellation of images that made large-scale extraction seem not only necessary, but natural. Embedded within the image are more ambivalent messages, however. In popular culture, the story we tell about the mass extinction of dinosaurs centers on the dependence of life on its planetary environs, and therefore on the fragility of that reliance. The ad therefore links fossil fuels to an originary moment of mass extinction. Within the valorization of the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, then, are the seeds of its undoing, a, perhaps unconscious, recognition of overreach. Here, we can also locate a link to photography. The Hercules Powder Company supplied papers to photographic industries, highlighting the complex imbrication of chemical, extractive, and photographic industries. Photography's desire to transcend its material origins parallels oft-hidden extraction processes. Despite the centrality of mining to economies, extractive capitalism functions by making industrial production largely invisible. It shifts attention to the commodity, not the labor or materials that make it. Consumer capitalism encourages us to forget how commodities are made. The networked or so-called dematerialized world of the present is profoundly relied on resource extraction. In the context of climate crisis, extraction is a pressing material problem. According to a recent United Nations report, resource extraction is a primary driver of global climate change, responsible for half of the world's carbon emissions and more than 80% of biodiversity loss. Despite the increasing awareness of the impact of extractive activities in contributing to climate change, the annual global extraction of materials by ton is increasing by 3.2% per year. So while the world's population has doubled since the 1970s, resource extraction has tripled. Once extracted from the earth, raw natural resources are transformed into consumer goods, which bear little evidence of the complex networks of human and non-human labor that brought them into being. In the process, extraction's history of labor displacement and ecosystem destruction are cast out of view. The seductive fantasy that the world is becoming altogether dematerialized is only possible because corporations deliberately aim to obscure the labor of extraction and its environmental costs. These consequences are felt most acutely in what Macarena Gomez-Bariz calls extractive zones, resource-rich regions that are often far from cities and centers of power. Environmental injustice tracks the fault lines of race, class, and geography. But taking this integral relationship between form and matter as the starting point, I propose a reorientation of perspective that restores the photograph to histories of materials, land, property, and labor. A structural analysis that considers the people, places, and beings that bear the costs of hyper-extraction is necessary to address the urgent challenges of the present. And while the extractive gaze teaches us to see nature as a resource, there are alternative viewpoints that enable us to see nature and human relationships in different, more expansive ways. Extraction is never an all-encompassing process that displaces all forms of living and relating. In part, seeing extractively is rooted in deliberate forgetting, a refusal to reckon seriously with the inheritances of the past. By naming the structures and processes that have produced the interlocking crises of our current historical moment, photographers and artists can and have intervened in an extracted visuality, making visible what extractive capitalism seeks to render invisible. So understanding the ecology of photography and its possibilities in the context of climate breakdown requires holding the complex material realities that underpin the image in tension with the ways of seeing it makes possible. If we want to address the challenges of the present, the past holds many answers for us. We can learn resilience and resistance to colonial capitalist modes of hyper-extraction by entering into better relations with our own histories and our own responsibilities in the present, and recognizing the patterns and values that underlie our relationship to the natural world is the first step to transforming these relations. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. That was excellent. Let's move over to Jarrod now, if you're willing to share your screen. I'll spotlight you.
Yes, thank you. Okay. No, paused. How's that?
It's good, but we have Siobhan instead of Jarrod on the side.
Okay. Do you mind sorting that out? And
I'll sort that out, and you just carry on.
Okay. Well,
there we
I'll
go.
speak
You're
out.
on. You're on.
All right, great.
Thanks, Jarrod.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Siobhan, for that great presentation. I'm looking forward to talking about it and discussing it with you all later on. I'm grateful to you for the opportunity to present this seminar series, and the time difference is no worries for me. It's kind of, I think, the cost of doing business as a global historian in Australia. Thanks again to you, Andrew, Emma, and John for lining this all up. And again, I'm looking forward to discussion soon. So I'm obviously tuning in from Australia, from my apartment on Camera country, just north of Warrane, Sydney Harbour. As I do at the start of every presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the Camera people, their elders past and present, and their ancestors for taking care of this place for generations. Also, I'd like to extend my acknowledgement of the Camera to all other traditional owners in Australia and other settler colonial sites. And I pay my respects to all those elders and carers for country, and finally to any First Nations people joining this seminar today. All right. So, let's see if this works. No, that's no good. Are those pictures coming up or not?
I don't think they are. No, it's just little.
That's not ideal. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Okay, let's start that again. How about that?
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Okay, so as you've seen on my title slide today, I'll be presenting some work on the Kimberley Diamond Rush, mining photography and modern earth science. I'll get into that properly soon, but because this is part of this larger collaborative project on the modern history of the ancient supercontinent Gondwanaland, I want to acknowledge, the kind of place of this work within that broader project. So as some of you will know from Alison Bashford, who leads this project, from her presentation at UCL last year, this project stems from the surprising for some realization that the megacontinent takes its name from the central Indian Adivasi Gond people, whose coal-rich lands fascinated English geologists and anthropologists from the beginning of the 19th century. So my role in this project, then, has been to trace the utility of this idea of Gondwanaland from its 19th century coal survey roots to the later 20th century, when it becomes a powerful example of the latest major paradigm in geology and in earth science, plate tectonics. So historians of the earth sciences, like Naomi Oreskes and Henry Frankel, have been intermittently interested in Gondwanaland, which usually comes up in the context of big late 19th and early 20th century scientific debates about land bridge theory, mountain building, or continental drift. One point to make here is that this intellectual history has focused overwhelmingly on the so-called leading lights of earth science, working in places like the UK and the United States. And one reason why we all started working on this project was to gather up the evidence of how people in other sites around the world were thinking about the Earth and its shape over time. So the link with today's topic then is twofold. First, as Andrew kindly mentioned in the introduction, I have some expertise in the history of photography. In my first book, Visions of Nature, I argued that settler colonial landscape photography emerged from and was shaped by contexts of aggressive resource extraction and exploitation. In the Australian colonies of the 19th century and in California, these resources were typically gold, but also, as Siobhan observed, they included silver and mercury, as well as copper and open space itself. If you look hard enough, I argue, we can observe these extractive settler colonial contexts and forces at play in images of so-called wilderness landscapes, as well as those of urban places, in pictures of botanical specimens, and of farms and crops, all the way to portraits of Indigenous peoples. That book was mostly, I think, about charting a kind of, a visual economy of dispossession and extraction as it was operating in these kind of key settler colonial sites in the late 19th century. The second link here is that, inspired by my colleagues at New Earth Histories, led by Alison Bashford, but also originally Emily Kernan and Adam Bobette, I followed this extractive theme into my current project, which focuses as much on the history of extraction as it does on the history of earth science per se. And this is the second link, which is the argument that I'm making about Gondwanaland, is that it became such a powerful concept at this time, not only because of the evidence marshalled in its support, but because of its practical utility as a descriptor of commodity-rich lands. Now, the primary uses of Gondwanaland seem, in my view, to have been to link mineral-rich sites in India, Australia, Africa, and South America together in a globalizing geological imagination. Now, the point I want to start with today is that the Kimberley Diamond Rush, and indeed the photographic renditions of it, some of which we'll see in a moment, played a really important part in the development of this globalizing geological imagination. I think that this is a really good example of how speculative geological knowledge triggered escalating extraction, in this case, coal and diamonds in Southern Africa. As extraction intensified, geologists were presented with new opportunities to develop new knowledge about earth systems and earth processes. And this process was both documented and fueled by photographers, whose images of the mine fed into financial and scientific networks. And it's this dual kind of balanced photography feeding into these financial and scientific networks that I'm really trying to hit strongly today. So the Kimberley Diamond Rush began in the late 1860s when two unlikely finds exercised interest in Griqualand West, a stretch of territory in between the Cape Colony, the Transvaal Republic, and the Orange Free State. Although the land was technically under the control of the Griquas, a group of Afrikaans-speaking pastoralists originally descended from Cape settlers and the Coco, it was also home to Bantu-speaking people and some European settlers. You can see it here on the left in the light blue. During the late 1860s, some of these settlers reportedly found translucent stones on the banks of the Orange River. In 1867, the Cape Colony naturalist, William Atherstone, identified the fingernail-sized Eureka diamond, and in 1869, a Griqua shepherd found the much larger Star of South Africa. News of these finds triggered an influx of prospectors, and by 1871, a British party uncovered the first of the great diamond-bearing sites at Kimberley. After witnessing political struggles over the diamond fields and the arrival of tens of thousands of prospectors at the beginning of this so-called new rush, the Griqua leader Nicholas Waterbour handed over control of the region to the British Crown. Griqualand West then fell under the administration of the Cape Colony, whose newly appointed government geologist, Edward Dunn, departed for the diamond fields in late 1871. Dunn was born in England, but after emigrating from Bristol with his parents on the eve of the Victorian gold rush in 1849, he grew up in the southern Australian gold mining town of Beechworth. When he arrived in Cape Town, he was 25 years old and boasted training in the Victorian Land Survey Office, practical experience on numerous geological surveys in Victoria, and a recent qualification as a mining surveyor. So Dunn spent 3 months on the diamond fields in 1871. At this stage, most of the work was being conducted on the surface, excavating hills or kopjes, or sifting through drift gravels with water. Dunn reported that diamonds were mostly being found within about 3 meters of the surface, but some had been recovered from veins as deep as 10 meters. And you can see a diagram here on the right, the hills or the kopjes where the diamondiferous rocks are in red, following through to a creek there in the middle, or a runoff site. So the sites and the camps that supplied them swarmed with labourers, mine owners, shopkeepers, prospectors and government officials. Between 1870, when activity around Kimberley really began to intensify, and 1871, the population of the diamond fields swelled from 5,000 to as much as 50,000. Among others, Australians and Californians made their way into the interior of South Africa and applied gold rush techniques to digging, crushing and washing gravel. New arrivals coached in from Port Elizabeth, from Durban and Cape Town, and cities and towns across the Transvaal Republic and the Free State emptied out. Many Africans too made their way across the continent to join the rush, with over 30,000 working in the Kimberley mines during this first boom period. So historians refer to this period of immense social and economic change as the mineral revolution, and diamonds were at the very heart of it. The rise of the diamond industry in the decades after the 1870s totally transformed Southern Africa. Early finds inspired British colonists to move back into the interior of South Africa to secure new wealth, reordering social relationships between Boer settlers, Griqua shepherds, and Indigenous and other African peoples. Significant amounts of foreign capital also streamed in along with the new arrivals, and a series of major settlements sprang up around the diamond fields to serve the workforce. However, the work on river, drift and kopje deposits quickly began to produce diminishing returns. The mine owners who marshalled British, European and American capital began to pursue industrial underground extraction. And you can see the beginnings of this here on the left. Manual labour remained an important part of the industry under company mining though, and larger operations depended even more on the work of Africans. Nevertheless, diamond extraction was increasingly industrialised during the late 1870s as mine owners invested in technology to improve productivity, but also to haul, transport and process diamond-bearing gravel. Cecil Rhodes and his partner Charles Rudd played an important part in this process when they began renting water pumps to various diamond mines in the mid-1870s. All these machines, however, needed a different kind of fuel than the diggers who had crushed and washed the gravel at Du Toitspan in 1871. Many could run by burning timber, and they did, but real advancements in productivity relied on the identification and the importation of quality coal deposits. So by this stage, surveys working across Southern Africa, Dunn included, have been on the lookout for quality coal seams for decades. Coal was well known to be a precondition of colonial development as early as the 1830s, when European settlers in Natal first noted coal seams there and further south in the Eastern Cape. By the 1860s, there was enough evidence for the great Irish geologist Thomas Oldham, who had mapped the Gondwana system in India, to predict the abundant high-quality coal systems of the subcontinent may well extend to Southern Africa. During the first stirrings of the Kimberley Rush, geologists such as George Stowe, the enterprising student of African landscapes and peoples, went looking for signs of Oldham's vast fossil basin extending from India to South Africa. In 1876, then, Dunn was directed to survey the Stormberg coalfields and help develop the Cyphergat colliery in the Eastern Cape with the same hopes. But it wasn't until 1878 actually, when Stowe was working as a surveyor for the Orange Free State, when he discovered a 12-foot thick coal seam in the Transvaal near present-day Vereeniging. Unlike the seams in Natal and the Eastern Cape, this deposit was on the high belt. It was still a long way from diamond mining operations at Bultfontein and Kimberley. The distance was surmountable. So these discoveries came at a critical time during the Kimberley Rush. Stowe and Marks began supplying coal from the Vereeniging seams to the operations at Kimberley, such as the Big Hole and the De Beers mine. Those running the Cypher Gap colliery, meanwhile, sent coal for the Jagersfontein mine in the Orange Free State. For surveyors like Stowe and Dunn, the development of coalfields close to the diamond mines was the culmination of a steadfast belief in coal as the basis for colonial development. In this case, the introduction of fossil fuels to the energy mix of the diamond fields coincided with the end of the first stage of the Kimberley Rush. Reflecting on this transition period later in the century, contemporary observers like the journalist John Hobson note the wide range of people who worked on or were invested in the diamond mines during the 1870s. And during the succeeding decade, which began with the establishment of the two mining companies that would eventually merge to form De Beers Consolidated in 1888, this early diversity withered. Historians, as we might imagine, have focused heavily on this period. The social historian William Warger especially has charted how Rhodes's De Beers Diamond Mining Company and Barney Barnardo's Kimberley Central Diamond Mining Company successfully weathered labour struggles, exploited African workers, and swept up thousands of claims throughout the 1880s. All this was happening while the mines were adding new sources of power to the organic energy, human and animal labour especially, that had powered them through the 1870s. Indeed, while Rhodes and Barnardo were busy sweeping up leases and driving the diamond industry toward monopoly, their workers were shoveling increasing amounts of Permian and Triassic coal into new furnaces across the diamond fields. As Oldham and Stowe suspected, there were direct equivalents to the Gondwana system in South Africa, as there was in New South Wales. Noticeably, the coal from Vereeniging contained similar fossil plant specimens to the coal from West Bengal and the Hunter Valley, both well-known sites of rich engine-grade anthracite. And this information was both geologically and practically significant. Geologists and engineers knew from this equivalence that coal from Vereeniging, and to a lesser extent from Cypher Gap, could be used to effectively power water pumps, winches, crushers, pulsators, tramways, and washing machines. During the 1880s, miners used this fossil energy to descend further into the Earth's crust, cutting long shafts through the blue rock that contained diamonds. As they did this, geologists and engineers got a better sense of the dimensions of the cylindrical structures, which they dubbed kimberlite pipes, that punctured the landscape around the diamond fields. These geological facts would become more significant over the following decades, but in the 1880s, coal ultimately meant the same things in the Kimberley that it did in Bengal, in New South Wales, and in Victoria. The acceleration of fossil fuel extraction and consumption, in this case via diamond mining, was an exciting prospect. Diamonds were indeed the backbone of the country in South Africa, but coal had transformed England, and in the eyes of its late 19th century advocates, it would transform South Africa too. So it's in this context that I want to talk about an album here that was collected in, or that was preserved in Dunn's papers in the State Library of New South Wales. So as the diamond fields became the first significant consumer of South African coal, they also became an important symbol of colonial development. Throughout the 1880s, photographers such as the Port Elizabeth-based Robert Harris began capturing images of the mines, marketing them for sale, and showing them at major international exhibitions. Other photographers set up their operations on the diamond fields. In 1888, the Durban-born John Middlebrook established the Premier Studio in Kimberley, where he produced a number of albums depicting the emerging industrial landscape of the diamond fields. So these albums were effectively designed to promote the diamond industry. They documented the new intimacies that developed between Permian coal and labour, De Beers machinery, and high-belt diamonds. An 1892 album consisting of 24 photographs and accompanying descriptions, some of which we're looking at now, it begins deep underground, as we can see. This first image is at the end of a shaft, a place described evocatively here as the centre of all materiality. Middlebrook in this next image captures Cornish, Northern English and African miners at the face of the diamond-bearing rock. That then follows the progress of the rock up out of the mine onto what miners called the floors here at the bottom. These were simply flat exposed areas of ground where gangs of African labourers, supervised by white overseers, broke up the rock and loaded it into cars bound for the coal-powered washing machines. After further processing, the sorters working indoors separated the valuable gems from the gravel and collected them for display in the valuing and classing rooms at De Beers. So this hybrid system of human labour, machinery and fossil energy totally transformed the landscape around the Kimberley and Jagersfontein. The scale of these changes escalated markedly again in the years after 1888, when Rhodes and Barnardo secured the De Beers monopoly over diamond extraction and sale. The amount of earth moved in service of diamond extraction even compelled experienced geologists. Drawing from the tradition of representing landscapes in section, geologists and engineers began to draw the Kimberley mine with prior ground levels superimposed over the void that had been created. And this is another image sourced from Dunn's papers at the State Library of New South Wales. So these images were useful to De Beers because they communicated a certain command over the process of diamond extraction, and by extension, the natural, environmental and social conditions of the diamond fields. The company reproduced these diagrams, which dovetail nicely with the photographic representations of those like Middlebrook in their annual reports and in their investment prospectuses. For our purposes, these images give some sense of the quantity of material excavated in the first 20 or so years of the Kimberley Rush, and the amount of energy, fossil and human, that went into its extraction and processing. They also show how the process of extraction was intimately connected to a closer scientific understanding of the geology of the diamond fields. Now, the point here is that in the course of their work on the diamond fields, geologists, miners and photographers even prepared the stage for a shift that was as significant as Southern Africa's mineral revolution. Studies of the diamond fields, my argument goes, led to a scientific reconceptualization of the relationship between the inner and the outer earth. Even in 1874, it was clear enough that the giant pipes that diamonds were found in extended deep into the earth and had at some stage burst through the surrounding strata. The rocks that made up these pipes were considerably harder than the surrounding ground, hence the hills that existed before the rush, those that were marked in red in Dunn's diagram. Now, the project of diamond mining then from this period was also really a project of assessing the dimensions and features of these cone-shaped intrusions that punctured the crust. And as miners followed them down into the earth, they forced changes to orthodox geological models. By the end of the 1870s, for instance, curricula at South Kensington's Royal School of Mines were beginning to reflect these changes. Under the new direction of John Judd, who was a petrologist or specialist in rocks and rock types, students were pushed toward an outlook that gave more acknowledgement to a kind of planetary agency. Now, there are other strands to this story, which I'm happy to talk about further later on. But I think that these ideas of a dynamic planet that is both subject to human intervention and capable of world-changing force are essentially the ones that inform popular understandings of ecological or planetary crisis today. Obviously, too, they underpin the concept of the Anthropocene, which has been fueled by the very rocks that intensified the Kimberley Rush. So over the past 50 years, the well-known challenge of climate change has been thoroughly geologized. It's one aspect of the 9-part planetary boundaries hypothesis, which combines climate change with a range of other biogeochemical processes. And so geologists continue to debate where and how to best measure human impact within these systems. But I think the other task, which many of us humanities scholars are taking up, is to locate the historical ground on which these world-spanning notions were built in the first place. And I think in the Kimberley Rush, we can see one place/time where this idea of an Earth that could slip out of life-sustaining equilibrium was first brought to life in geological maps, in writing, in new ideas about the Earth, and in photographs. I'll leave it there. Thank you.